Well, thank you everyone for coming here. Let's make sure we can get some people from outside in here, and then let's kick this off. But to start with, I'd love for both of you guys to give a little introduction of who you are, what you work on. I'm assuming neither of you really need an introduction, but it'd be a nice way to start as always.
Start with Bryan.
Sure. Hey, Bryan Pellegrino. I'm one of 3 co-founders of LayerZero, and largely work on interoperability across all environments. So, yeah.
Hey everybody, I'm Altan, one of the founders of Nuffle. So we are a stake from anywhere solution where you can come from an L2 or an L1, stake your tokens into EigenLayer. So it's pretty basic, pretty much cross-chain work.
Wonderful. And so there's been a lot of discourse on Twitter recently surrounding a somewhat controversial statement. The statement that interoperability is solved, right? No more questions, it's done, it's solved, book's shut. I want to hear both of your take on this.
Who do you want to start with?
You, Bryan. I think it comes from your team originally.
Right. Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think the underlying, my best proof point for this is that our smart contracts are entirely immutable and have been in production for like a fairly long time and are still being used by far at the widest scale. I think when you talk about the core underlying technology of what are the trust assumptions, like what are the assumptions that an asset issuer or user needs to inherit from a bunch of untrusted state machines communicating with each other? What does that look like? What is the sort of most robust way for dealing with that, and where does risk sit? And then how do you actually make that super seamless for the end user, which is ideally that the user doesn't really need to think about the process of bridging, right? You just arbitrary contract invocation with a bytes array. All of that is done. You're talking billions of dollars a week moving right now over these rails, $100 billion plus built already on top of LayerZero, some of the largest assets in the world. This is not something that again, contracts are immutable. It just doesn't get changed. You have small things like, hey, we want to add this bit of compliance because of our token standard, or we want to add rate limiting or something. All of this stuff just lives at the contract layer. The underlying rails don't change. I think you see some things like pre-confs, like intents, like a bunch of stuff that say, hey, we want to actually bypass the asset issuer assumptions on the number of confirmations they're willing to trust before something is considered like final on an underlying chain. And I think that's like a totally reasonable abstraction layer to build on top of it, but the core technology is wrapped.
Yeah, so from an infrastructure perspective, I agree. I think definitely interop is solved. We have message passing intents, and a lot of teams are working within and outside of Ethereum. But when you look up, right, which is the apps layer, I think there's a lot to build. I don't think it's solved at all. I think we have, obviously, the traditionally has been the bridging UI, which is kind of, if you go to somebody who's outside of the crypto space, it's very hard to kind of deal with that. But now we're seeing products like Infinex and others, they're doing cross-chain swaps in a more abstracted way. But again, we're working on cross-chain swaps, and they are the main thing that we worked on. I think there's really interesting things we can build, which is cross-chain landing borrowing, which is like something, structured products that you can build across all chains with the sort of infrastructure that we have currently, and where the builders can come in and build really interesting products. At Nuffle, we're looking at some of the sort of quote-unquote dead assets and how do you bring them to other chains, which is quite interesting, and you can use those to do like lending and borrowing, which has not been possible, which with the whole interop being solved, I think they're available. So quite excited about that. The app layer, given that we hold all the infra and the network effects are kicking in.
Please give us wallets where multiple RPCs are connected at the same time, and the user doesn't need to manually do this.
Infinex actually has a really good way to kind of spin up accounts now, which is really good. And Privy is working on something similar as well.
And so my mental model for interoperability has always been it's effectively 3 components, right? There's a way that you assert state on a destination chain. There is state as in a representation of the block header. There's a way that you relay that assertion, and then there's a property that you check about that assertion, right? If you were to check a transaction inclusion, you call it a bridge. If you check a message inclusion, you call it a messaging protocol. If you check the state root, you call it a state proof. That's been my thinking historically. Are all 3 of those solved in your view? Is there nuance in kind of where the whole stack sits?
I think that was our original view early on. I don't actually, originally we built this thing that says, hey, you're going to take this route and you're going to do an entire Merkle inclusion proof on the destination chain. And what you realize very quickly is that if the person providing these things actually decides to just fork the chain, there is no way to actually do this. And this is, I think you and I discussed this about ZK a long time ago. In the early days of ZK, everybody was like, ZK means that Ethereum now is trustless. Messaging out of Ethereum is like entirely trustless. And what you realize is ZK gives you compression around a lot of signatures. But if all of the validators decide that in secret they want to construct a malicious block, create a snark of that block, and present the snark to the destination chain, that destination chain has absolutely zero idea whether that block is a canonical block in Ethereum. It will be accepted. It will be 100% valid. It will rug everything. And all of the people who did it will not be able to be slashed because you can't be slashed on a snark and you don't have the header and that block just gets thrown away, right? So there is everything is an attestation. And you can build systems around this to try to create more and more robust sets of attestations. You can provide economic guarantees around that. Again, I think ZK is very, very compelling because of the ability to compress a wide array of signatures and ideally have those systems underlying implicitly give you the ability to slash those. So there's a ton of things that can advance on that side of things, but I actually think all of these differentiation of what's happening, like none of that matters. Everything is just a set of attestations and a set of instructions. You're taking an array of bytes, you're invoking a contract with those bytes. It's an instruction set to do something. And you have a layer of attestation with some backing economic security or not. And everything reduces to that. There is nothing that is better unless you have these validators of your current chain, like dual mining and running nodes of both the other chains, which just isn't happening.
Yeah, one thing we talked about actually, which was quite interesting, right? So you have these three different sets of like what you can use. What you can build now is a set of different things, right? Like for example, you can use one tool to like make 20 minutes to get the transfer, but also you can pay something and be like, I'm going to pay $5 more and get a really quick sort of confirmation. So I think like these sort of wide range of different methods, you can get really differentiate products depending on the users, right? So that's quite interesting.
And so I really like the point you made there, Bryan, about the fact that if a subset of validators on, let's say, the weakest link in the entirety of a block space construct a malicious block and generate a proof of that, it could, in theory, rug an asset. And so I think where this is very relevant is when you're talking about OFTs, or assets that are natively cross-chain. How do you think about managing risk of a natively cross-chain asset?
Yep. So the structure, the approach we've always taken is, one, you certainly shouldn't have to trust us, which is why we've immutable contracts, the protocol is the protocol. Two, you shouldn't have to trust the third-party bridging provider. We saw this with multi-chain. We saw this with Wormhole Stack. We saw there's a bunch of others. If you have a single group or a single contract that controls all of the assets and a huge pool of risk, in an ideal world, the user is already using the asset. Most of these assets, whether it's USDC or USDT or any of these, have ability to blacklist a user and to do all of these different things along the way. They have controls to circle when SVB was blowing up, depegged by 7% because there was a chance the backing, there is embedded risk that you're already trusting the issuer, and I think the ideal world is that you trust the asset issuer, and so that is the goal of the DVNs. It's the entire architecture of LayerZero. Is like if you look at BitGo, $10 billion asset of WBTC, they provide their own attestation. LayerZero allows you to create effectively Circle CCTP for any asset, where the asset issuer becomes their own thing without needing to, in Circle's case, they had to rewrite all the smart contracts, all of the infrastructure, all of this stuff. It's on like a 20-minute timing window right now. All of this is done. It's been battle tested, been used in production, tens of billions of dollars. Anybody can do it. Anybody can create that. And so the whole point is the end asset issuer has the ability to make that attestation, to create their own CCT, to make it required. And then after that, if they don't, a lot of asset issuers may not want to be the sole, running blockchain infrastructure, may not be like the core thing at the center of everything that they do. And so then they backstop it with others, and they can use an array of other DVNs. They can use, ZK attestations. They can use all of these other things. And they say, listen, I must be included. I want to sign off on every single one. But in the case that something happened of my security, and me, the asset issuer, was hacked, and something bad happened, all of these other parties would need to be compromised at the same time. So there's ability to construct an attestation set, and everything, again, is that attestation set as diverse or not as you want. And really that just creates this Pareto frontier of cost versus security, and you can even gate it by transaction. And we've seen asset issuers start to do that and say, listen, if it's a transaction of under $10,000 with an aggregate outflow of less than $1 million, like I'll just do zero block comps. We'll absorb and internalize reorg risk and just let the users go. And we're going to choose just our attestation services signing off, or maybe the server, whatever is the cheapest option. We're just going to do it, and it's fast. And if you have any large transactions, if you have a large aggregate outflow, if you're anything, then I actually want to use 5 parties or whatever X number of parties, and you can construct it. There's all logic that just lives in a smart contract. So in my mind, it really should be not up to us, the protocol. Parameterization doesn't happen to this. All of these decisions live on a per asset basis, and they can be set in stone, and they can be immutable, and they can be all of the things that you would want. But it really is the asset, and then the user has a relationship with the asset itself.
There's a question, but you basically modularize the way how people do asset issuance, right? So you come in, you are the asset, your circle, let's say. For large transfers, you can add like 100 or whatever to attest. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, that's actually pretty good.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. I think when people think of cross-chain in general, they generally articulate it as a technical problem, right? Asserting state, relaying state, checking the inclusion of a property in state. And it feels like the area of risk management in cross-chain, specifically because reorgs are probabilistic, means that the way that you solve cross-chain is effectively by having great tech and even better risk management of that tech. And so how much of the future of risk management in cross-chain do you think falls on, let's say, a solver or a third party effectively underwriting the transfer of assets, and how much falls on a cross-chain protocol?
So this is something we thought about a couple of, 2.5 years ago. We released a product called Precrime. And what you really want, so you just have to, every single chain that you're on is effectively a black box. It does not know about the outside world. It doesn't know what canonical state is anywhere. And so we created what we call Precrime, which is every time that you're doing a transaction, right? There's a bunch of cases where you look at the Axie Ronin hack, and it's like $650 million is leaving, and there's now 0 left in the contract. Like, is that a valid answer? Like, no, but the thing issuing on the other side has no idea of that context, right? Same thing, Nomad hack. All of us watched it over like a period of hours, just like happen in real time as everyone's replaying these transactions. Precrime says every transaction that's going through, before that transaction gets finalized on chain, fork every single chain, fork every chain, run the state transition locally, verify the resulting state against a list of application-defined invariants, and like for a bridge, the invariant is like solvency, and only finalize this transaction and execute it if none of the invariants are broken, right? And so you can add in layers, and you can put this to some, again, there could be an entire chain who's doing, there's a bunch of, right now, in the beginning, it was usually the asset issuers running these checks themselves, so just giving themselves solvency checks or offloading that to a third party. But you could think of a network doing this. Again, we're agnostic to what that looks like. But I think absolutely there is like a very strong demand from the asset issuer side to want this and to want external sets of guarantees because again, the thing on chain that is being triggered is really just a set of instructions and a set of attestations. And it may be canonical state over there, and it may have been valid for a period of time, but now it's being double spent because of a reorg or something happened on some other network, and there's risk, and you don't want to actually, you want to be able to isolate that risk. So, yeah.
This is more from the technical side, but Predicate is actually doing something, right? Pre-transaction logic, which is Pumpernickel was here, which was kind of funny. But essentially, they're an AVS that allows you to write the predicate of the transactions and then say, hey, like this is, I don't want to send this to OPEC sanctioned addresses and all of that. So I think that's really important. It's the next phase where when we have a lot of RWS coming on chain is to make sure that like the transfers, don't go to certain addresses that were blocked. So that's the other security side, I guess. Yeah, and I just want to say, because I think it's easy, I get excited talking about these things because these are like the things that people want right now. But it's very important for me to say that like the protocol at its core is completely unopinionated, right? A bunch of this is like layers of censorship, and sometimes centralized asset issuers, Circle, et cetera, they have they want layers of censorship, and I'm totally fine with applications taking that decision and embedding that in, and users deciding to use that asset or not. LayerZero, the protocol itself, you cannot censor at the Rails level. You cannot do any of this stuff. All of this stuff is logic that is built in a smart contract that lives on the chain above, and then interacts with LayerZero itself. But I'm very, very strongly of the opinion that the actual underlying technology should not have any of this built into it itself, and all of this should be layers of abstractions that are built on top of that people can then use or not use.
I think that's very well put. And so we've talked about risk management. We've talked about the technical aspects of interoperability. But let's talk about kind of what's being productized on that. What I think is very interesting about, I think, all of the things both of you are building, right, from LayerZero messaging to LZ read to now intent work with a priori to the work that Nuffle is doing with restaking from anywhere. All of these are very different embodiments of how assets can be moved or state or information can be moved between chains, all for different kind of use cases. What are you sort of seeing in terms of where users most want to use cross-chain infrastructure right now with each of these products?
Yeah, this is an interesting point. So I think traditionally, I worked at Near, so when in 2020 we had Rainbow Bridge, which took from Near to Ethereum, it synced around like 8 hours. So if you want to come from Near and Ethereum, I literally remember taking my Near and then try to go to Ethereum and then like waking up to take the Ethereum. That's a terrible experience. We're at a point where there's a lot of assets in top 20 that are like, have not touched Ethereum, have not touched Solana, all these very, very demand centers. And I think it's interesting to build products around taking these assets, giving these users the ability to tap into demand centers. Like, if a user wants to go to Polymarket, sitting on Near, they should be able to do that, right? So building those things, I think, building the products around the interop that we're building is something that's like we're interested in. Also, stake from anywhere is kind of similar at Near. If you're sitting at Near, you have no access to EigenLayer. So if you can do that, that's something that we solved, I think.
To be clear, the assets in the top 20s that aren't anywhere, these are like the Cardano, Ripple, Stellar, all of those assets that exist. Yeah.
Ripple, Bitcoin.
Yep.
Bitcoin has been traditionally
Bitcoin's a perfect example. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, from my side, listen, when I think about the problem, I really think about it as purely generic messaging. So I actually don't think about all of the stuff that's being built on top. I have to put myself in a product mode to do that. What I see very clearly from the product side, there's a couple of things. Asset issuers are very, very drawn. One thing we've had a lot of success with is on the stablecoin side of things. So stablecoins, you talk Athena, Ondo, PayPal, PYUSD, USDT. We just got announced as the #1 provider for the Wyoming stablecoin yesterday. So a bunch of these, we had a lot of success in stablecoins, and what almost all of them are drawn to. If you're looking for an asset itself, like what are the properties of a stablecoin that you want, and really you want maximum utility. You want it to be used in markets. You want it to have demand to flow in. And one thing that OFT just natively provides is, listen, I was just talking to you guys, we did $80 million transfer into Kraken for $1.50. You can send $1 billion between L2s for literally a fraction of a penny. And so when the underlying movement of the asset itself, when inventory no longer becomes a problem, now the ability for market makers on all of these long tail chains to be able to arb spreads, to sub-cent spreads, to be able to rebalance inventory, to be all of that, cost of capital, cost of inventory, cost of needing to wait 7 days to move back to Ethereum, all goes down drastically, which means spreads get tighter, which means users are paying less slippage in general, which means overall cost in the system and friction goes down, which typically means volume goes up. All of these things are things that are very attractive to them. So one, I think there's a demand from that side. And the other thing is very clearly everybody over the last 18 months has moved to a consumer lens where they don't want the users to think about chains or gas or any of this. It should be fast. It should be, a matter of seconds. They should be able to hold USDC and not think about what underlying asset they're using. And all of these different things are two things that I think very clearly have strong, proven demand centers from the asset issuers and from the user side.
Yeah, I mean, I think I like the conversation of the second order effects, which is if we move forward with the assumption that interop is solved, what now? What do people now build on that? What is now enabled? And what are the problems that need to be solved next for crypto to really gain more adoption? And so I think the idea of being able to very easily abstract away chains from users on top of a universal messaging layer makes a lot of sense. But what are the other second order effects? Like what else is now possible if we assume that interop is no longer a problem?
I'll say I've had very strong opinions on this for a long time. I've been wrong for a long time now. I think I'm going to be right, but I definitely have been wrong so far. If you think about what a blockchain actually is, a blockchain is just a bunch of computers who are effectively replicating compute and coming to consensus around that. And so when you're building applications on a chain, every single chain right now is being built in a purely monolithic structure. It wants to house as much as humanly possible. But then you look at how we actually build any application at scale in the real world. Everything is microservices. There is nothing like, no real world system is built on like a single monolithic computer, especially not one that's supposed to be replicated, 10,000 times across all of these other computers. So like you're just going to hit vertical scaling limits of single systems. I'm very much of the opinion that once you solve the frictionless movement between these things, that you have the ability to, one, build stateless applications. You have the ability to have applications move to being more inherently asynchronous, rather than right now everything is built to be completely atomic and synchronous and have full composability. And that's just not how anything in like any system today is built. It just doesn't exist. And so I think we'll see a very large push towards that. And I think we'll see you'll have a VM or an environment that lives here, and right now we've seen a ton of like shades of gray get launched, small changes. I think a lot of that gets washed away with scale. I think things that make very strong trade-offs on a given vector, just like with microservices, we have things for compute, and we have different database structures, we have things for all of these different systems. I think you will see environments that are hyper-optimized along a given vector being used in combination to create applications that hopefully are more rich and orders of magnitude more complex than kind of what exists today.
Yeah, I mean, modular has been a big topic, I guess, over the last 2 years. It's kind of interesting to see that we've started with modular in terms of blockchains, but even cross-chain message design is kind of modular. So you have modular systems, on top of that you have modular systems, and you also have another sort of degree of freedom on top of that, which is interesting, right? Which allows you to people come in and build, experiment with things, maybe use assets that were impossible in Ethereum, use that and see what comes out of it. So a lot of experimentation comes ahead, and with that we get new technologies. I'm pretty sure LayerZero was one of them. I come from Near, so I really like asynchronous systems, right? One of the things that we liked about sharding was that you can build really cool things with asynchronous systems. So yeah, I'm quite excited that how people will experiment with cross-chain modularity, so to say.
Now, I guess the way I have been thinking about cross-chain in the context of rollups is that the biggest competitor to a rollup cluster is an efficient cross-chain market. The reason that the superchain can charge 15% sequencer fees is because of the liquidity of Base. The reason that early stage financings for rollups typically come with liquidity deals is because of the network effects around liquidity. If we remove the constraints of movement of liquidity between chains and further remove that between clusters, what does that mean for L2s? Do we reach a full commoditized L2 market? Do all the network effects accrue to the cross-chain protocols? Where do we sit?
I mean, if you look at layer 2s right now, like what do most of these intranets, as we view them, really provide? And typically they're trying to provide you strong guarantees within a given system. Like that's what they're saying, right? And so they're saying, listen, if you are interacting with each other and you're doing something based on what the other one said, they can rug you if you're not waiting until the data actually gets posted back to layer 1, right? And so this is so we all agree to roll back together. We all have some system to roll back together. And then now we can do things on like a faster. So you're getting a faster experience. So they're pushing for like shared trust, consumer experience, and then ideally having that liquidity flow very quickly between there because there's a system to do that. If everything looks like that, I mean, I guess the question is that what they're really getting? And I would argue that most things in the superchain are not there because they have that. They're there because there is a shared alignment of a network effect around like ecosystems that will support each other effectively, right? Like I think Unichain and Base and Inc. and all these others that are collectively together, people are going there because they're saying, hey, I want to be like adjacent to these things. And there's like strong network effect there. Arbitrum has their own network effect. Elastic Chain with ZK Sync is creating their own network of things that are there. I think when you get towards the longer tail of chains, they still are looking more for distribution and network effect versus like the technical benefit of joining this thing. And I think that pull will still be as strong regardless. Even if all of the interop is exactly the same, whether you're within that group or without that group, I still think people want to join that group for marketing, for distribution, for all of the other things, for integrations into the existing network effects of consumer apps that are built around those ecosystems that they end up building out themselves. There's just all of that, and I think that's like actually a way stronger factor than almost anything else.
So the network effects around liquidity will potentially dissipate, but the network effects around brand, ecosystem, user base will persist.
Discoverability, right?
Yeah. And do you think the same premium of, let's say, 15% sequencer fees will exist in that world, or do you think that's an artifact of liquidity being the primary?
I mean, I can take like a really heretical stance here and say, like, listen, a lot of the layer 2s today are still basically, and for a very long foreseeable future, effectively their security is their multisig. Their multisig can change and rug the underlying at any point in time because Ethereum will introduce new opcodes and will switch to Verkle eventually, and we'll do all of these other things that will be breaking changes for the layer 2s. They will never throw away those keys. And so none of them in the current state truly inherit the security of the underlying of Ethereum. And they're really just like alt L1s paying rent to Ethereum because they get alignment and network effect and all of these other things. So like, I think there is, yes, I think even in the world where all of those things are solved, until Ethereum decides that they're actually just going to internalize L1s, L2s themselves, and they're part of the layer 1 validator validation process, that all of these things will be, but I think a lot of it is like second order effects, and I think we're getting closer to stage 1 and eventually stage 2, and like all these things are happening, but I don't think the multisig is going anywhere, which means I think a lot of what we're talking about at the core of layer 2s themselves already are showing the fact that it is more about ETH alignment and is more about the value that you get from that ecosystem and being a part of scaling that ecosystem, even if the underlying technicals are like a little bit muddled, than it is about anything else. Because you're not actually getting in the current state, you're not actually getting ETH L1 security, right? So you're not paying all of these fees to L1 and this X tens of millions of dollars a year for security. You're paying it for alignment and for getting a user base and for everything else that comes with that.
So 15% would be paid to kind of alignment in a way, to optimism, more of that.
Marketplace fees is a reason people want to be in the Apple Store, and everything is like these. These are just natural driving effects in almost any marketplace.
I guess you're paying 15% for composability too, right? Like if Optimism delivers what they deliver, then you can actually, like, if your game, you can immediately put a Uniswap interface and can swap, get the liquidity, and I guess all the chains are kind of not specialized in terms of their technology, but more like specialized in terms of their branding and like what they deploy, and you can just compose.
Yeah, you can assume each of these intranets will try to have a series of applications that owns the consumer that gives value for why people want to join that intranet.
And will people build an aggregator on top of that too, or is this?
Surely they will. I mean, naturally, of course.
I like that. I think people often very heavily index on liquidity as the primary instrument for why people join the superchain. Why a based rollup is less appealing than not based rollup, sovereign rollup is less appealing than an Ethereum aligned rollup. But I do agree that the shared user bases, the shared ethos, the shared alignment, all of that stuff, some of the more intangibles are incredibly valuable. And discoverability, to your point as well. I guess the final point I kind of want to get both of your take on is what this year looks like for interoperability. Assume the technicals are solved, right? Is this the year that everyone adopts interop into every component of the application? Do we talk about cross-chain apps anymore, or is every app just implicitly cross-chain? Like, how quick are we moving there? What do things look like?
All right. Again, in terms of like, go back a couple of years, we had millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars being issued into these. Now we have $100 billion on top of OFT, like $240 billion of asset issuers, $100 billion of actual assets, like real significant assets, pushing $100 billion of movement across these environments. Like all of that is happening. And so the question is like, what happens next? The assets are there, the infrastructure is there. I think you have a couple of things. I think you have infrastructure itself getting pushed into like market makers using on the back end, exchanges no longer needing to deal with inventory issues on the back end. I think you see, again, post some of these upcoming EIPs, gas abstraction is a core concept, even on a single chain starting to go, but a lot of that being done in a by groups that service many chains. It's the same groups that are doing cross-chain solving or gas abstraction or asset swaps or any of this, who are also doing the underlying, hey, take your USDC only and we'll convert it to the gas beneath. I think all of the push towards the cross-chain stuff is really towards having it sit in the background and the user, in an ideal world, not need to think about bridging and not need to think about any of this. Now, I still think a lot of it will, like, I think net messages will go up because people will actually start using the rails in ways that they're not using them right now. Like, the groundwork is laid. There is a bunch of systems, whether it be exchanges, whether it be market makers, et cetera, who are going to start to slowly integrate this stuff and start to slowly use it in the back end. But if you look at the applications themselves and how quickly most major apps go to rebuilding, to actually fully abstracting something, it's possible to be done this year. It just won't be done because people move slowly.
I guess the way to think about it is that there's new L1s now. And if you're a new builder, there's always something that people spin up dexes, money markets, and there's always incentives for you to go there. So by that default, people just build on one chain, and then if they really get successful, like Jupiter themselves, they can go a bunch of different chains. So I don't think that's going to change. I hope there was a world where people start building multi-chain from the start, but it's just that, you know, how humans work. It's not a technology problem. It's more of a human thing that you just start building on one ecosystem, get to know a bunch of people, get successful there, and then start building on different chains as you get a brand, pretty much. So that's how I think about it.
Yeah, every application, every asset issuer is like you know, they're a behemoth. They want to consume as much as possible, as much TVL, as much AUM, as much usage, as much, you know, all of this. And so I think naturally when they expand to the bounds or confines of their current environment, they must expand, and they typically do.
Example, Athena, I guess that's the one.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us today.